$10 million in a single weekend from the most secure bank in France, with no weapons, no violence, no alarm triggered, no hostages, no confrontation with a single security guard. The bank's own engineers, the same engineers who had spent years designing what they called an impenetrable vault, would later stand in the ruins of their masterpiece and have absolutely no explanation for how a group of men got inside. And when the police finally figured it out, when they found the hole in the floor and followed it back through 8 meters of hand-cut tunnel into the city's 19th century sewer system, the lead detective turned to his partner and said something that roughly translates from French as, "We are never finding these people." He was almost right. This is the story of Albert Spaggiari, portrait photographer, chicken farmer, ex-paratrooper, patient, meticulous, and deeply philosophically opposed to being told that something was impossible. In the spring of 1976, Spaggiari walked into the Société Générale bank on the Rue de l'Hôtel de Poste in Nice, France, rented a safety deposit box, and locked an alarm clock inside it. He went home. He waited. He wanted to know one thing. At midnight, when that clock started screaming inside a steel vault buried under a meter of reinforced concrete, would anyone in that building hear it? Midnight came. Nothing happened. No siren, no phone call, no police. And in the dark, for the first time in months, Albert Spaggiari allowed himself to smile. 60 days later, he and 20 men would crawl up through the floor of that vault, spend a long holiday weekend eating foie gras and drinking red wine inside it, and walk away with the equivalent of roughly $30 million in today's money. They would leave behind a picnic table, a stack of empty wine bottles, and a single sentence painted on the wall. Sans haine, sans violence, sans armes. Without hatred, without violence, without weapons. The question is, how does a soft-spoken portrait photographer from Nice, a man who gave lollipops to children who wouldn't sit still for their family portraits, pull off what the French press would call le casse du siècle, the heist of the century? To understand that, you have to understand who Albert Spaggiari actually was, because he was not what he appeared to be. He was never what he appeared to be. And that gap between what people saw when they looked at him and what was actually going on behind those eyes is the entire story. Chapter 2. The Man Nobody Saw Coming. The year is 1933. Albert Spaggiari is born in a small town in the Jura region of eastern France, near the Swiss border. His family is unremarkable. His childhood is unremarkable. He grows up in the way a lot of French kids grow up in the 1940s, in a country that is first occupied, then liberated, then left to sort itself out. At 19 years old, Spaggiari enlists as a paratrooper. He's sent to Indochina, the First Indochina War. If you're American and that name doesn't immediately ring a bell, think of it this way. It's the war that came before Vietnam, in the same jungle, fought over the same basic questions about who gets to control what, and it ends almost exactly the same way. France goes in convinced of its military superiority. France comes home, having lost. Spaggiari comes home from the jungle with a combat medal, a quiet and permanent contempt for institutions, and a set of skills he would spend the next 20 years finding uses for. He knows how to be patient. He knows how to operate in conditions that break other people. He knows how to plan something down to the last detail and then execute it without flinching. He also comes home with a set of opinions about French society, about who has money, how they got it, and how little most of them did to deserve it, that never really leave him. In the years after the war, he drifts. He works as a photographer in a small Italian-French border town. He buys a stone farmhouse in the hills above Nice and raises chickens. He keeps a typewriter on the kitchen table and writes angry letters to newspapers, arguing about politics, about inequality, about the complacency of the French ruling class. The newspapers never publish him. In his late 20s, he commits a small armed robbery. Records are murky on the specifics, but the broad strokes are well documented, apparently, at least in part, to impress a woman. He gets caught. He goes to prison. And here is where, I think, the real Albert Spaggiari is born. Because he comes out of that prison a genuinely different person. Smarter, more patient, more careful.
He tells people he has no interest in ever being caught again. What that statement actually meant would take another decade to become clear. By 1975, Spaggiari is 43 years old. He runs a small portrait studio on the Rue de France in Nice. Wedding photos, first communions, family portraits in the back garden. He charges fair prices. He smiles at difficult mothers-in-law. He gives sweets to children who won't sit still. He is, to all appearances, a pleasant, slightly eccentric small business owner who smells faintly of darkroom chemicals. What nobody knows, what nobody has any reason to suspect, is that for the past year, Spaggiari has been conducting the most methodical surveillance operation in the history of French criminal planning. 3 streets from his studio stands the Société Générale bank on the Rue de l'Hôtel de Poste. Spaggiari visits it constantly. He pays small fees in cash. He stands at the counter and asks harmless questions. He notes which security guard covers which door and when. He maps the angle of every camera in the lobby ceiling. He watches the armored truck schedule. He studies the cleaning crew's routine. He goes home, pours himself a glass of wine, and writes it all down. By the spring of 1976, Albert Spaggiari knows that bank better than most of the people who work there. And what he has concluded, after a year of study and one very informative alarm clock experiment, is that the most secure bank in southern France has one flaw. A single gap in its defenses so obvious, so glaring, that the engineers themselves apparently never thought to look for it. Because they were looking at the vault. Spaggiari had been looking at the dirt underneath it. Chapter 3. The Vault That Couldn't Be Robbed. To understand what Spaggiari was actually planning, you need to understand what was inside the Société Générale on the Rue de l'Hôtel de Poste. Because this was not an ordinary bank. This was the financial nerve center of the French Riviera. Beneath the marble lobby, behind a single enormous steel door, lay the largest private vault in southern France. 4,000 individual safety deposit boxes stacked floor to ceiling along every wall. Steel-reinforced concrete on all 6 sides. Walls thick enough to absorb a direct hit from a military explosive. And at the center of the whole system, a time lock mechanism so sophisticated that the vault door physically could not be opened by anyone, including the bank's own director, once it sealed on Friday evening. You had to wait until Tuesday morning. 4,000 boxes. And inside those boxes lived the private wealth of the Côte d'Azur. Industrialists from Marseille, hotel owners from Cannes, aging aristocrats with villas above Monaco. The kind of people who had been stashing their money away from the French tax authorities for decades. Cash that had never been declared to anyone. Gold that had been smuggled out of Algeria during the colonial collapse. Diamonds in velvet pouches. Stock certificates for companies that officially didn't exist. And here's the detail that I think is the most interesting part of this whole story. Boxes full of documents, photographs, letters, evidence. The private secrets of some of the most powerful people on the French Riviera. Rumors circulated that the mayor of Nice himself, a man named Jacques Médecin, kept a box there. The bank's appeal was simple and absolute. It kept no central register of what was inside any individual box. Your secret was your own. Legally, officially, on paper, half the wealth in that vault did not exist anywhere on Earth. The Société Générale's engineers had designed the whole system around a single principle. You cannot rob what you cannot reach. The walls were the defense. The time lock was the defense. The fact that the vault sealed every Friday for a 4-day weekend wasn't a vulnerability. It was the entire point. By the time anyone realized something had gone wrong on a Tuesday morning, a thief would have had 4 days to disappear. Assuming, of course, that a thief could have gotten through a meter of reinforced concrete in the first place. And because they were so confident in those walls, the bank's engineers had made one decision that would prove to be catastrophically expensive. They had not installed a sound alarm inside the vault. Why would they? The vault was buried under a meter of steel and concrete. There were motion sensors on the door. There were cameras in the lobby. Nobody was getting into that vault without triggering something above it. The engineers were so focused on what was happening at door level, at the top of the vault, that they never thought about what might be happening at the bottom. Albert Spaggiari had been thinking about the bottom for over a year. He had spent weeks walking the streets of Nice with copies of the city's 19th century sewer maps under his arm. Nice, like most old Mediterranean cities, is built on a labyrinth. Beneath the boulevards, beneath the cafes and the postcard shops and the tourists eating ice cream, runs an entire second city of stone tunnels. Some sections date back to the Napoleonic era. Some are wide enough for a grown man to walk upright. Some are barely wide enough for a man to crawl on his stomach. Spaggiari went down there alone, with a flashlight and a compass, mapping the tunnels by hand. He emerged in the small hours of the morning, smelling of waste and damp stone, went home, showered, slept for a few hours, and opened his studio at 9 o'clock. What he found was this: a municipal storm drain running 8 meters from the floor of the Société Générale vault. 8 meters of dirt, then concrete, then steel, then more concrete. A straight line. He had his route. Now, he needed a team. Chapter 4. The Sewer Gang. Let me be direct about something, because I think it gets glossed over in most tellings of this story. What Spaggiari asked these men to do was genuinely brutal. He traveled to Marseille and recruited through the criminal underworld of the south of France, men he knew from old networks, men who could be trusted to keep their mouths shut. Welders, locksmiths, ex-soldiers. By the late spring of 1976, he had assembled a crew of roughly 20. The French press would later give them a nickname that stuck: Les Égoutiers, the Sewer Gang. In May 1976, the digging began. Every night, after the last cafe in Nice closed its doors, the team disappeared into the sewers. 4 to 6 men at a time, working in shifts. They strung hundreds of meters of electrical cable through the tunnels to rig up lighting. They inflated rubber rafts to float tools across the wider flooded sections. They hauled rubble out in their pockets, a few handfuls at a time, so the city's sanitation workers wouldn't notice anything piling up downstream. Some of them stood waist-deep in human waste for 6 hours at a stretch. The smell, by all accounts, was something beyond description. The air was thinner than they expected, methane pockets, bad circulation, and at least one man passed out from the fumes and had to be dragged back to the surface through the dark. Another cut his hand on rusted iron, refused to come up, and finished his shift bleeding through a rag tied around his wrist. Spaggiari himself was down there with them every single night. The soft, smiling portrait photographer with the wedding pictures in his shop window, crawling through the sewers of Nice at 2 in the morning. I find that detail, the contrast between the man his client saw and what he was actually doing every night,
almost impossible to fully absorb. His customers were bringing him their children's first communion portraits. He was digging a tunnel through a 19th-century sewer with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. He said good morning to the same bank teller he was about to rob. He fixed his studio camera in the afternoon and drove to the sewer entrance after midnight. For 60 nights. 60 nights. By the second week of July, the tunnel was finished. 8 meters of hand-cut earth ending at a thin shell of reinforced concrete that, on the other side, was the floor of the most secure private vault in France. Now Spaggiari needed one final thing. Time. He picked the date with the same precision he had applied to every other decision in this operation. The 14th of July, Bastille Day, was approaching.
France's national holiday fell on a Tuesday that year, creating a long holiday weekend. The bank would seal its vault at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, the 16th of July, and not reopen it until Tuesday morning. 96 hours. 4 days. Complete silence above and around the vault. He told his men they were going in the night of the 16th. Chapter 5. The Long Weekend. On the night of Friday, July 16, 1976, just past midnight, 20 men climbed down into the storm drain beneath the Rue de l'Hôtel de Poste. The equipment they bring in would stock a small construction site: acetylene torches, electric drills, picks and sledgehammers, hydraulic jacks, 30 tanks of compressed gas, electric saws, and then air mattresses, folding tables, crates of food, bottles of wine, cases of water for 4 days. They crawl the final 8 meters of the tunnel and reach the underside of the vault floor. Breaking through takes most of the night. They cut in short bursts, then stop and listen. Every few minutes, one of the men stationed at the sewer entrance signals the team to freeze. A footstep on the pavement above, a car braking too hard, a drunk shouting good night outside a bar. And the entire crew goes completely silent until the sound passes. And then they start cutting again. Sometime in the early hours of Saturday morning, the last section of reinforced concrete gives way. Albert Spaggiari becomes the first uninvited human being in history to stand inside that vault. He looks up. 4,000 safety deposit boxes line the walls around him, floor to ceiling, on every side. Gold doors, steel locks, the private fortunes of the Côte d'Azur stacked in rows. And then he does something that, even now, knowing everything that comes next, I think is one of the most audaciously smart moves in the history of this kind of crime. He walks to the great steel vault door, the one the bank's engineers had spent years designing to be impenetrable from the outside, and he welds it shut from the inside. Now the vault is a sealed room. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. No one can be surprised by an early arrival. No sudden check. No cleaning crew, no security guard, no bank manager doing an unscheduled sweep. The vault belongs to them until they choose to leave. And then, and I genuinely love this detail, they set up a folding picnic table in the center of the vault. They unpack foie gras, baguettes, cheese, bottles of Bordeaux. They drag the air mattresses through the tunnel and stack them along one wall. And in rotating shifts around the clock, they begin opening boxes. They use a custom-built hydraulic press. Each box takes about 6 minutes from start to finish. The press, the pop of the lock, the door swinging open. Whatever's inside, sorted into keep piles and leave piles. Close the box. Next, cash in French francs, dollars, Deutschmarks, gold ingots stamped with the seals of European foundries that had been closed for decades, stock certificates for companies that officially didn't exist, diamonds folded in squares of black velvet,
Bundled letters, some of them tied with ribbon. Photographs of people doing things that, if those photographs ever surfaced, would end careers and marriages from Nice to Monaco. The documents, the letters, the photographs, those they leave, scattered across the vault floor. They take everything liquid, everything that converts to money. Outside, the Côte d'Azur goes about its holiday weekend. Families on the beaches, tourists at the restaurants, fireworks the night before over the harbor. Inside the vault, the team sleeps in shifts, eats foie gras, opens box after box, and drinks the wine. By Sunday afternoon, they have worked through 371 boxes. And then the weather changes.
A summer storm rolls in off the Mediterranean. Above ground, the sky over Nice opens up. The low ground, in the sewers, the water level starts to rise. Fast. If the storm drain floods, if the tunnel fills, the team's only exit disappears. The 8 meters of hand-cut tunnel connecting them to the surface becomes impassable, and the men inside the vault have no other way out. They start packing up early. They move with the controlled urgency of people who have rehearsed this moment, but hoped they wouldn't need it. Before he leaves, Spaggiari does the last thing he has been planning. He walks to a clean section of the vault wall. He hands each man on the team a different paint marker, a different color, a different style. And one letter at a time, with each letter painted by a different hand so no single person's handwriting can be forensically matched to the message, they write a sentence on the wall of the most secure bank in southern France.
Sans haine, sans violence, sans armes.
Without hatred, without violence, without weapons. In the early hours of Monday morning, July 19th, the team disappears back into the sewer. Duffel bags of cash and gold dragged behind them through 8 meters of dark tunnel. At the surface, they split. 20 different directions, 20 different cars, 20 different destinations across southern France. 8 hours later, the manager of the Société Générale arrives at work. He places his hand on the vault door. The time lock has released. The door should swing open. It does not move. He calls his assistant. They try together. Nothing. He calls the police. It takes 6 hours to cut through the welded vault door from the outside. When the officers finally step inside, what they find immediately becomes one of the most photographed crime scenes in modern French history. The picnic table, still set. Empty wine bottles. Air mattresses against one wall. 371 open boxes. Diamonds and bonds and old love letters scattered across the floor. And the sentence on the wall. Not until a junior officer walks the perimeter of the vault and notices a small, dark hole in the corner of the floor does anyone begin to understand how it was done. Chapter 6. The Chase, the Catch, and the Window. The investigation that followed was enormous. Hundreds of officers across multiple jurisdictions, Interpol searches of known underworld safe houses from Marseille to the Italian border, nightclubs raided, known fences questioned, French franc banknotes flagged at every customs post in Western Europe. For 3 months, nothing. Here's the part that I think the bank and the police and the French government would probably rather you not think too hard about. A significant portion of the depositors who lost things in that vault, the wealthy, the secretive, the people whose boxes contained things they had told no one about, never came forward to report their losses. Because coming forward would have required explaining what they had been keeping in those boxes. And for many of them, that conversation was worse than the loss. So the bank quietly settled a handful of claims. The official victim list was incomplete from the start. The full value of what was taken, estimated at around 46 million French francs at the time,
roughly $10 million in 1976 money, closer to $30 million today, was never precisely established, because some of those fortunes, officially, had never existed. In late October, 3 months after the heist, an ex-girlfriend of one of the team members walked into a police station in Marseille. Within a week, that name led to 2 more.
Within 2 weeks, the name at the center of everything reached the investigators. Albert Spaggiari is arrested at Nice airport in early November, stepping off a flight. He smiles for the cameras. He smiles for the magistrates. He gives a calm, complete, cheerful confession to organizing the entire operation. And then, he refuses to give up a single member of his team. Not under questioning, not under pressure, not under offers of reduced sentencing. He gives the investigators a long, detailed list of false names, false addresses, and internally consistent stories that go absolutely nowhere. He apologizes, with a smile, for occasionally forgetting details. The French judicial system, which had expected a frightened, middle-aged photographer, found itself dealing with a man who had apparently been preparing for this conversation as carefully as he had prepared for the tunnel itself. He is held in a prison in Nice through the winter of 1976 and into 1977. And for 4 months, the investigation inches forward on the strength of informants and forensics, while Spaggiari sits in his cell, reads books, and waits. On the morning of March 10, 1977, he is transported from his cell to the office of the investigating magistrate, Judge Richard Bouaziz, for another round of questioning. The room is on an upper floor of the Nice courthouse. The window is open. It's a warm spring morning on the Riviera. Spaggiari sits across from the judge and answers questions in his usual manner. Calm, cooperative in tone, helpful in appearance. He leans across the desk and hands the judge a document, a hand-drawn diagram of part of the tunnel, something he has apparently decided to share. Judge Bouaziz takes it. He looks down at the paper. Spaggiari stands up. He walks toward the window. He says he needs some air. And then, Albert Spaggiari jumps out of the window. He drops 2 stories onto the roof of a parked Peugeot in the courtyard below, rolls off the roof into the street, climbs onto the back of a motorcycle that has been idling at the curb for over an hour. The motorcycle is gone before anyone in the courthouse has made it to the window. I want you to sit with that for a second. A man who organized a 2-month sewer tunnel excavation had also organized his own escape from police custody, complete with a waiting getaway vehicle, while he was supposedly cooperating with investigators. The hand-drawn diagram was a prop. The question about needing air was choreography. He had been planning this since the day he was arrested. Some weeks after the escape, the owner of the Peugeot opens his mailbox. Inside is an anonymous envelope containing a check for 5,000 francs, made out personally to him, for the damage to his roof. No return address. No signature. No note. Chapter 7. The Aftermath, the Myth, and the Bill. Albert Spaggiari spends the rest of his life in Argentina, moving between Buenos Aires and Madrid and, according to some accounts, spending periods in a quiet villa somewhere in the south of France that no officer ever successfully traced. A French court tries him in absentia and sentences him to life imprisonment in 1981. The sentence is never served. The Société Générale never recovers most of the money. Of the 46 million francs taken from that vault, only a handful of gold bars are ever traced and recovered. Most of it simply flows into the criminal economy of Southern Europe and disappears. In 1978, from somewhere in Latin America, Spaggiari publishes a memoir. The title, in French, translates roughly as The Sewers of Paradise. It becomes a bestseller in France. 2 films are made about him within a decade.
In 2018, 40 years after the heist, an aging Marseille mobster named Jacques Cassandre publishes his own book claiming that he, not Spaggiari, was the real mastermind behind the whole operation, and that Spaggiari was just the front man. A French court bans the book and convicts Cassandre of money laundering in connection with the heist. Make of that what you will. On June 10, 1989, in the small coastal town of Hyères, an old woman walks out of her house and finds her son lying in the courtyard. He is 56 years old. The cancer in his lungs has finally caught up with him. He has spent 12 years moving between cities, living under false names, staying just far enough ahead of any warrant that no extradition ever landed. He never returned a single franc to the people he stole from. He never gave up a single one of his men.
From the moment he stepped through the window of Judge Bouaziz's office to the morning his mother found his body 12 years later, Albert Spaggiari did not spend one more day inside a French prison. Now, I've thought a lot about what to make of this story, and I want to be straight with you, because I think it's worth being honest about the ambiguity here. There's an obvious version of this where Spaggiari is a folk hero, the clever underdog who outmaneuvered the institutions of the powerful, the man who broke into the secret vaults of the Côte d'Azur elite, many of whom had gotten their money in ways that were themselves of dubious legality, and walked away without hurting anyone. The French press certainly played it that way. The films played it that way. The memoir played it that way. Sans haine, sans violence, sans âme. It's a great line. It's a genuinely great line. But I keep coming back to the people on the other side of those boxes. Not the industrialists. Not the politicians. Not the people with undeclared cash and smuggled gold. I'll be honest, I don't lose a lot of sleep over them. But there were 4,000 boxes in that vault, and not every one of them contained the proceeds of tax evasion. Some of them contained the life savings of people who had put their money somewhere they thought was safe. Some of them contained documents and jewelry that were simply gone when Tuesday morning came, irreplaceable regardless of any check the bank might eventually write. The heist did not discriminate. And yet, there's a reason this story refuses to go away. There's a reason France made 2 films about him. There's a reason a 40-year-old mobster's memoir claiming credit got banned by a French court, which is arguably the best possible marketing outcome. There's a reason le cas du siècle is still, almost 50 years later, the phrase French people use for something that seemed impossible, and then wasn't. Because what Spaggiari actually did, beneath all the romanticism, beneath the foie gras and the painted message and the motorcycle waiting at the curb, was identify the one assumption that an entire system had built itself around. The assumption that the walls were enough. That if you make something hard to reach, you've made it safe. That the people planning against you are looking at the same thing you're looking at. He wasn't looking at the walls. He had been looking at the dirt underneath them for a year. That's not a lesson that stays neatly inside the world of French bank robbery. It applies everywhere. Every institution, every security system, every competitive advantage that gets built around a single assumption eventually meets someone who spent a year looking at a different angle. Every vault has an 8-meter tunnel underneath it. The engineers are always looking at the door. Spaggiari spent 60 nights underground and came up with $30 million and a sentence on the wall. The Société Générale spent years designing a vault that couldn't be robbed and got a hole in the floor and a bill they couldn't fully calculate. The assumption cost them everything. The patience, the unglamorous, tedious, standing waist-deep in waste patience, cost him 60 nights in a sewer and made him famous forever. Chapter 8. The Close. Here's what I keep thinking about.
The alarm clock. The very first move. Before the tunnel. Before the team. Before a single shovel went into the ground. Spaggiari walked into that bank, rented a box, locked an alarm clock inside it, went home, and waited. Not to see if the vault could be reached. He already knew it could be reached. He waited to see if anyone would notice something happening inside it at midnight. That was the real question. Not can I get in, but will anyone hear me when I do? They didn't hear the clock. They didn't hear 60 nights of tunneling. They didn't hear 3 days of hydraulic presses and drilling and 30 tanks of compressed gas being used 8 meters below the lobby where they stood. The most secure bank in France had built everything around the assumption that the threat would announce itself, that it would trip a sensor, trigger a camera, require someone to get past the door. And because that assumption was never tested, never questioned, never even articulated as an assumption, it was just the way the vault works. Nobody ever thought to check for the things Spaggiari was actually doing. I think about that in a lot of contexts I'm not going to name here. But I suspect you can fill in the blanks. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you're now going to spend the next 3 days thinking about 60 men in a sewer and foie gras in a bank vault and a motorcycle idling at a courthouse curb, drop a comment with the single moment in this story that you cannot get past. I read everyone. I'm genuinely curious whether everyone lands on the same thing, because when I asked 3 people before making this, I got 3 completely different answers. If you want more stories like this one, the ones that fell out of the news cycle but probably shouldn't have, subscribe to Boardroom Files. New video every Friday. I'll see you there. And next week, we're opening a file on a company that built $1 billion empire on a product that didn't technically exist. And the people who should have caught it early had every reason not to look.